Hello, and welcome to Setting the Standard, the podcast about wireless radio standards creation from the Wireless Innovation Forum. I'm your host and Communications Director of the Forum, Stephanie Hamill. Today I'm talking with Andy Clegg of Baylor University and CTO of the Forum about his new highly dynamic spectrum sharing workgroup and their newly published technical reports created to address spectrum sharing solutions for the future. Hi, Andy. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Hey, Stephanie, how you doing?
I'm doing well, thanks.
Good.
I brought you here to talk about two new reports that your group has produced. Can you tell me a little bit about the group and what you're doing with these two reports?
Yeah, so we recently set up the Highly Dynamic Spectrum Sharing Task Group in the Wireless Innovation Forum. And our goal is to take what we're doing today in spectrum sharing, so for example, CBRS and 6 gigahertz automated frequency coordination, extend some of the work that WinForum has done in those areas and make it so that some of the techniques we use can support spectrum sharing on a much faster time scale than what we're doing today. So for example, CBRS, when we become aware of an incumbent, we can reconfigure secondary users in a matter of about 5 to 6 minutes, which is great. That's working perfectly in CBRS right now. There's never been a case of reported interference to the DoD. And in 6 gigahertz automated frequency coordination systems, the standard power access points only need to check in once per day. So we can't really do anything more dynamic than every 24 hours. But what we're realizing is if we move to shared spectrum bands that have more dynamic systems like airborne systems, for example, we will need to be able to detect and reconfigure much more quickly than what we're doing today in CBRS or 6 gigahertz AFC. So we stood up the Highly Dynamic Spectrum Sharing Group to look at what we've done in CBRS and 6 gigahertz AFC and how we can extend it to or make, compact it almost to a much more dynamic timescale. So in doing that, we've created two new technical reports, TR 2016 and TR 2017. TR 2017 is actually sort of a precursor to TR 2016. What we do is we talk about the timescales that are at play in various spectrum sharing regimes. We talk not just about CBRS and 6 gigahertz AFC, but we talk about spectrum sharing that's being done in other countries, Ofcom, and in other areas, in the kind of dynamic timescales that are at play in those spectrum sharing scenarios. And we realized we sort of had to define the timescales and define what highly dynamic spectrum sharing means. So we examined all the different sharing regimes and used that to come up with a new definition of highly dynamic spectrum sharing, which the bottom line, we are now talking about sharing on timescales as short as a few seconds. So that's, after all of that, that's what we come down to in defining highly dynamic spectrum sharing. So we also created the second technical report, TR 2016, which is where we actually got down to the business of taking what we've done already and making it more flexible and more dynamic to support highly dynamic spectrum sharing. And we also discuss in that document some techniques and technologies that could be used, some newer techniques and technologies that could be used to support highly dynamic spectrum sharing. So those are two more or less companion types of technical reports, but TR 2016 is really where we get down to the business of showing how we can support more dynamic spectrum sharing.
Thanks, Andy. Can you tell us a little bit about how you shorten the timescale and what some of these new concepts are?
Sure, yeah. So what we've got in TR 2016 is an examination of what we're doing today, what's working well, and what could be improved. So one of the concepts we talked about was the concept of distributed incumbent sensing. So right now, we detect DoD and the CBRS band by dedicated sensors around the coastline. And these sensors are only located every, couple of 100 kilometers along the coast. And they're big, purpose-built system. So the idea is, what if you distributed your sensors much more densely than that? And that accomplishes two things. One is it increases the probability that you'll detect the incumbent because you have more sensors working on it. And it also reduces the possibility of false detects. False detects can be very disruptive to spectrum sharing because you block your secondary users from using the spectrum for no real good reason. So it's not a very efficient way of sharing the spectrum. We also examine the concept of RAN-based sharing. RAN means radio access network, which basically just means over the air using your cell phone or the base station. And so the idea is, could we use traditional base stations or handsets or whatever to take some of the sensing capability in the network? And then, of course, those are very distributed. You have base stations all over, and you have tons of users with handsets and things like that. So if those devices or base stations were able to detect the incumbent, you've got a built-in distributed sensing network. Now, there's a lot of challenges with that because remember that a handset and a base station, when they're on, are typically transmitting. A base station is essentially always transmitting. So trying to detect something that could be a weak radar signal, for example, while you're also transmitting, can be challenging. We've heard that people are doing it. We've certainly seen a number of academic papers saying it can be done. We'd like to go beyond the academic exercise and see it actually being demonstrated. And it's one of the topics we're actually dealing with actively in highly dynamic spectrum sharing. We have presentations on companies that are developing RAN-based sensing. So that'll be very interesting. We talked a little bit in TR 2016 about incumbent self-sensing. This was an idea we floated 3 or 4 years ago to DoD. They weren't very enthusiastic about it. They still aren't, but we still think it's a good idea. And that is, where is the signal to noise for detection the best? It's right there next to the incumbent. So let's say you have an aircraft carrier with a radar. If you could place your incumbent sensor right there on the aircraft carrier, you're not going to miss the radar because it's, a matter of dozens of feet away and it's transmitting 1,000,000 watts. So what a reliable place to put a sensor. There are some definite pluses to doing that, but we have to get DoD, or I guess now the DOW, on board with doing that. And I use on board purposely. So we'll see how that goes. We're looking at extending the use of dynamic protection areas and DPA neighborhoods. It's a little complicated to explain in a short segment like this, but a dynamic protection area is the area where an incumbent may be operating, and a dynamic protection area or DPA neighborhood is the area around that DPA where we have to consider secondary users to be potential interference sources. Right now, they're just defined along the coastline because that's where the ships operate that we're protecting. But what if we defined, the entire country? We put, a little honeycomb pattern around the entire country and designated every area to be part of a particular DPA. And if we made these DPAs small enough, we could accommodate virtually any scenario, including airborne. So you launch something into the air, you can just have a track of DPAs that it's going through, and you can activate the corresponding DPA neighborhoods in sequence and reconfigure the secondary users. It works in CBRS right now, but again, we're dealing with ships that move very slowly. We want to be able to move with things like airplanes that move a lot faster. In CBRS, we've had a lot of success with what's called an informing incumbent capability, or IIC. It's an online portal where, under certain circumstances, the Department of War can inform us of where and when they're going to operate, and the spectrum access systems can monitor this portal and then reconfigure the devices accordingly. It's a really good system from the SAS perspective because it's very easy to implement. It's essentially 100% reliable in terms of protecting the military incumbents. It does require the military incumbents to sort of lift a finger because they have to go and schedule things in there. So they're not quite as enthusiastic about it, but they have been using it. So if we could extend the use of informing incumbent capability, it could make highly dynamic spectrum sharing a lot easier. one of the really interesting things that we talk about in TR 2016, and we've been kicking around before and since then, is the concept of closed loop interference feedback. So, right now, I said earlier, there's never been an instance of reported harmful interference to DOW incumbents in the CBRS band. That's a good thing, but what it probably means is that we are overprotecting, and in fact, perhaps vastly overprotecting the military incumbents, because you would think if we're right on the edge and using the spectrum totally efficiently, we would be right on the edge of causing interference to them. But instead, we've never had a reported case of harmful interference, or any interference for that matter. But we don't know how much we're overprotecting them. What if their systems could have a closed loop interference feedback where they just monitor for interference in their baseband signal or whatever, and if and when they receive interference, they could feed back to a centralized spectrum access system or whatever and let them know. And then at that point, the spectrum access system can dial back the secondary users until the interference is below the interference threshold of the incumbent user. That way, you've optimized the use of the spectrum, because you are operating up to and just below the point where you're causing interference. So that's a really interesting concept, and we're going to explore that further. And then, finally, another concept, one of the other concepts, there's several others, but one of the other concepts is how can we detect the clutter in the local environment in order to better sense how much we are protecting the incumbents. Right now, we really don't know for sure what kind of clutter, and I mean clutter means buildings, trees, anything that can block a radio signal. We don't really have reliable, detailed knowledge of what the actual clutter is between a secondary user and the incumbent, and how much it might be blocking the signal. We want it to block the signal. We want the secondary user's signal to be blocked so that it doesn't interfere with the incumbent. But we don't know how much clutter in reality is between the secondary user and the incumbent. And we talk about sensing methods that can help a secondary user sense how much clutter is in the surrounding area, and therefore how much additional protection it has towards the incumbent, so that we could take that into account when determining how much power the secondary user could use, or whatever. So that's a very interesting concept. So you'll have to read TR 2016 to see how we go about doing that. But it involves GPS. So that's a very interesting concept. It's one of the ways of doing it. So that's a quick rundown of some of the techniques and technologies we're looking at in TR 2016, and how it can help support more dynamic, or what we're calling now highly dynamic spectrum sharing.
Right. I feel like we could do episodes on probably each one of those.
Yep,
they're so in depth.
Yep.
Okay, well, so you kind of alluded to this, but what are some of your future plans then to kind of vault off of these two documents?
Yeah, so we are iterating on TR 2016, meaning that this first release that has come out, we really wanted to get it out in time for what was originally called the moonshot, spectrum sharing moonshot, which is what it was called in the National Spectrum Strategy. And then it has become now called the Advanced Dynamic Spectrum Sharing Demo, or ADSSD. That we wanted to get this version out in time for that. So we tried to work quickly, and we got it out in time. What we'll be doing for the next iteration of TR 2016 is refining some of these concepts, defining them in more detail, and also inviting additional concepts that people didn't have time to submit for the first version of 2016. So it really is going to be a matter of going into a bit more detail on some of these things, and maybe even the initial results of experimentation on some of these things, because I know that there are some groups already working on RAN-based sensing, working on interference feedback, working on a number of these concepts, enhancing the informing incumbent capability. So, we may be able to get information about the current state of that better in the next issue. Next issue. It really is sort of almost a serial publication that we're hoping to make out of 2016. So stay tuned for that. And if you aren't a member of WinForum and you have things to contribute, by the way, you should certainly consider joining WinForum and participating in the highly dynamic spectrum sharing task group. It's one of the more active task groups we have right now. So please consider joining if you're not a member already.
Yeah, I was going to say, it seems like a great time for someone who has a concept to go ahead and contribute.
Yep.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much for your time. Is there anything I missed that you want to add?
No, I think that's good. It's a very exciting time for WinForum and spectrum sharing, as you may have noticed in some of the even congressional actions in the One Big Beautiful Bill, talking about bands to study and the potential of sharing in some bands and things. So it's a very hot time for spectrum sharing, and especially highly dynamic spectrum sharing, because the bands that are being talked about are things that are a lot more dynamic than ships moving around off the coast. So yeah, it's a really good time to be talking about this.
Yeah, a lot of energy around it right now. It's pretty exciting.
Yep.
Okay, well, thanks, Andy.
Yep. Thank you, Stephanie. Thanks everybody for watching.
Have a great rest of your day.
All right. Take care.